Hello, welcome to Rappler Talk. I'm Marites Vitug, and joining us this afternoon from Hong Kong is Arnold Chung, Policy and Research Officer of Demosisto. He is one of the key organizers of the leaderless Hong Kong protest movement. And thank you very much, Arnold, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
And maybe just before we proceed with the interview, can you give us a bit of background on Demosisto and what is the role of Demosisto in these protests which are reaching already its sixth month?
Well, Demosisto is a youth activist group and also a political initiative established after the umbrella movement. So we established like 3 to 4 years ago, and we fight for democracy and self-determination in Hong Kong. And we focus on both street protests and international advocacy. Well, we are the members of Demosisto were some of the leaders back in the umbrella movement. So many foreign medias and different people around the world may look for Demosisto for information and other stuff for the whole movement in Hong Kong. So we are one of the organizations working very hard on the movement, but we are not the leader of the movement.
Yes, there are two major events which have taken place in the past days. One is that the pan-democracy movement had won a landslide in the district elections. And the second is the U.S. passed its Human Rights Act, which really supports Hong Kong and will apply sanctions to China if they violate your human rights. So what are the impact of these two major developments on the protest movement and on the pan-democracy movement?
Well, I think for the election part first. So this election results actually shows how dedicated Hong Kong people are in our demands on democracy and free elections. The movement has been going on for 6 months, and there are many voices suspicious that as there are escalation of the movement, as there are more and more confrontation and more violence, especially from the police, that the Hong Kong people are no longer supporting such a movement, and the movement may die down eventually. But the landslide victory also shows that Hong Kong protesters are actually on the side of majority of Hong Kong people, so that it is turn for the government and for the Hong Kong government and for the Beijing to really think about the hardline policy on Hong Kong people. About the U.S. human rights bill on Hong Kong is actually a strong message sent from the Western society that they are on solidarity to the Hong Kong's movement. And I think the proposed sanctions that they could impose to officials of Hong Kong and also to Beijing indicates that Beijing may need to take the prize in suppressing Hong Kong autonomy and freedom.
Are you also lobbying for a similar bill or act from the European Union? I just saw in some news reports.
Well, yes, for the next step we are going through, we are hoping to lobby for similar mechanisms that could be operated from the side of the European Union or the UK or other parts of the world. So it is what we are hoping for is that we could have many more allies from all over the world to support the movement in Hong Kong, that they could really impose a threat, or they could tell a strong message to Beijing that they should not interfere or they should not suppress the autonomy of Hong Kong.
What is the impact on China of these two major events which happened in the past few days? Some are saying that, it won't really bother them, but others are saying it's sending a strong message to Beijing. What is your analysis, or what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think the U.S. bill particularly do have a direct impact on the side of Beijing, because as they have issued a lot of statements stating that they are they have a very strong stance that the U.S. should not enact such a law, or they should not impose such a law. But Hong Kong has still a very important role for Beijing in terms of financing and economics. So the U.S. proposal of sanctioning Hong Kong's officials, or actually canceling Hong Kong's special status is actually very harmful to Beijing and very harmful to the harmful to Beijing. But other side is about the district representative elections. So actually, the district representatives do not have much of a political power or political influence to the whole political system, but the election results still show a very strong message to Beijing that they need to rethink their overall policies towards Hong Kong people. Because after this district election, in a year, there will be another much more important legislative council election that will have much more influence to the whole political system of Hong Kong.
But the LegCo, or Legislative Council, is not directly elected by Hong Kongers, right?
Half of the seats are directly elected from Hong Kongers, but half of the seats do not. But the point is that the Legislative Council still have a very high influence to the whole political structure of Hong Kong. And if Beijing continue their hardline policies, then there is a threat that pan-Democrats or the side of the protesters will actually gain more than half of the seats, despite of an unfair election structure at the very beginning. So this will be very harmful and to the rule of Beijing.
Yes, the protests have been going on, as we said earlier, for 6 months. And initially, one of your demands to withdraw the extradition bill has already been fulfilled. So, but still you have 5 demands. Can you walk us through, because these have evolved through time?
Yes, well, at the very beginning, the whole thing is about the extradition bill, as you've mentioned. So Hong Kong people do not want themselves to be brought back to China, so we stand up against the bill. But as government has tried to treat our protests, they used a lot of brutality. They are calling us rioters despite of our peaceful protest. So we have established at the end a total of 5 demands, and the two most important of them now is the independent investigation of police brutality, and we want to have a completely free election, which is democratic in both our legislative structure and our executive structure.
So those are the key demands now. How about the resignation of Carrie Lam? Is that one of them?
Well, the resignation of Carrie Lam is actually one of the demands proposed by the protester at the very beginning. But as the movement goes on, people soon or later find that it's not about one principal official resigning of her place. It's about a structural reform that Hong Kong really needs democracy, so that our leader will be accountable to the people of Hong Kong, but not just to Beijing.
Okay. So far, Arnold, how many have been arrested or are behind bars in this past 6 months?
Well, numbers of being arrested has been raised up to more than 5,000 already. But most of them are on bail right now, so there are not much being imprisoned right now, because the legal procedures hasn't been really started yet. But until now, there are more than 100 of them are being held under detained for months, waiting for the trial. They are not allowed to bail out, so there are hundreds of them.
A lot of reports have described the protests movement as leaderless, and you yourself said that in a talk I heard you give in Taipei. So how do the protests get organized if it's leaderless? Can you describe to us how it's done?
Well, I think there are, by means of I call the movement as leaderless. I would say there are no single person, no single leader, no single political party or activist group which are responsible or which are really holding or leading the whole movement. We are working on a principle very similar to crowdsourcing. People will raise their ideas, their concerns on online platforms, for example, forums, for example, instant messaging networks, and people will discuss, and they will discuss which part of the whole thing they could participate, and then we will fit ourselves into different roles that will be beneficial to the whole movement. So there are no single leader, but different people are finding different roles inside the movement, so we could all together push the whole thing forward.
And also it was described in news reports, and one of your colleagues spoke about this before, that you use, let's say, Telegram as a, as a way to communicate with hundreds or hundreds of thousands of those protesters. So do you vote on issues using Telegram? How do you do that?
Well, yes, there are many functions on these instant messaging, and especially on Telegram, that there are people writing different bots or functions or programs that we could utilize these online platforms to actually anonymously vote for something or have a poll on something that we could gather around information or the people's ideas on particular issues. So we use these online platforms to really conduct discussions that we could work on the ideas or the different proposals later, and different people will then come up with different ideas and different campaigns, different activism movement or protest, and people will join them eventually. So this is how the whole thing is organized, and that's why it is very difficult to government to suppress the whole thing, and that's why the movement is still having some vitality to go on.
Yeah, and you also said earlier that there is no, grand plan or grand strategy. You don't plan, this is what we're going to do this week or next week. So how do these ideas come up? They are all crowdsourced, and then you vote on them and then decide, okay, let's go to universities this time. Is that the way it happens?
Well, it mostly is about it's mostly crowdsourced. So people are very open in discussing ideas with others, that what plans or what is the next step they are wanting to do. For example, they want to establish another round of street protest, or they would organize an assembly on a particular topic, that people will have a primary plan, and then they will discuss online whether this should go on or whether the details should be, and then they could refine the whole plans, and then we could work on that.
So, but is there a core group? I mean, let's say a group of 10 or a dozen of you, or the organizers who meet regularly to assess, where are we now? What's our next step? Or are these all done online?
Different people are thinking. Different people are looking into what is the next step, but we don't have a really strong structure or very structural discussion on which people are supposedly to decide what part of this movement. The essential thing about the crowdsourcing is that people are free to participate in the parts that they would like to join or they would like to think of. So everyone is allowed to think of the whole strategy and is free to discuss online. And if we find some sort of a consensus, then people will work along that consensus.
I think what's happening now has been really different from the umbrella movement in 2014. That the protest at the time, were you part of that already, or you were still?
Well, yes, I have. Yeah, I've joined the umbrella movement as a student, so
Yes.
I've also won a part of the umbrella movement. And back in the days, we have a much more.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Back in the days, we have a much more structural approach in organizing the movement. That we have major student activist groups or major political party. They are participating in the movement, and people tend to follow them, and they are also thinking about those what we call the grand strategies or grand planning of the whole movement. So it's actually become easier for the government to target or work on how to dissolve the whole movement. And the features I mentioned earlier is actually something we adapt from the government strategy in trying to contain our movement. So as we crowdsourcing everything, well, the government may know all about them, but they are unable to really suppress the whole movement.
Yes, and also there's a lot of reports about disinformation from the mainland, and people from the mainland coming to Hong Kong to disrupt the protests. How do you deal with this?
Well, I think the problem of disinformation happens all over the world, especially the new strategies for authoritarian regime to really um, work against democratic movements or democratic states. But how we deal with the disinformation as we are trying to establish our information system, we try to establish our fact check systems so that people could, at the very least, can get some fact checked information that was designated will be confirmed to be true, and then we could work on that. It is very difficult to really shut down these disinformation, especially we are just a movement. We are not a government that could really prevent those things from happening. But people are tend to use reliable sources, and the press is working really hard against disinformation or information that were supposedly to be infiltrated by Chinese. So press are very alert on that, and people is also very dependent on trustworthy information sources.
This is the longest ever that protests have taken place in Hong Kong, right? This is the first time that it has
Well,
stretched
yes, I think
to
for
6 months.
such a long period,
Yes.
yes.
So how is this changing Hong Kong? People are saying, oh, it's destroying Hong Kong. It used to be the financial center. It used to be a magnet for tourists. So how they're saying it's destroying Hong Kong. What are your thoughts on this criticism of the protests?
Well, I think the protests do have a strong impact on the economy, on the daily operation, so-called daily operation of the whole society. But I think it's part of the target or the part of the objective of the movement actually, because we in the movement of Hong Kong we have the scorched earth policy tactics, which means that we are willing to sacrifice our own economic well behavior as a chip as a bargain for Hong Kong government to really respond to our demands. So I think it do bring some harm, but what we need nowadays is not the so-called stopping of the protest, because what is actually causing the most economic problems or the hiccups or the anything or the backslide in Hong Kong is on the police side. It's the police brutality that makes people worry about their businesses in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, we usually see that even there are protests around, business could operate very naturally. The business are still ongoing. There are not much problem for people who are not participating in protests to shop, to eat in a restaurant, and whatever. But when police comes in, and when they shot tear gas and they try to use brutal forces to suppress on the protest, then shops around are forced to shut down. So I think it's still the government side to provide really a political solution, but not keep relying on the police to violently suppress the movement that will create an exit for Hong Kong and Hong Kong protests.
Arnold, you mentioned the scorched earth policy. I mean, and I've heard other young Hong Kongers say that, they're willing to, go through all this sacrifice. Aren't you scared at what will happen to you? China is so heavy-handed. They can have you arrested. They can even make you disappear. So aren't you scared that you're up against a giant of an enemy?
Well, I think this tactics actually shows how dedicated is Hong Kong people this time on our fight towards democracy and freedom, because most of our people really think that this would be our last chance for really to uphold our freedom and democracy, because over the past 2 decades, as Hong Kong has been handed over back to China, our autonomy has been slowly eroded. It has been very recently that these problems has created a much stronger image, but actually our autonomy and our freedom has been corroded bit by bit every year. So people are getting very worried, and we are very dedicated to fight as the large chance. There are actually quite worrying that we had heard rumors and reports about protesters being brought back to China and whatever. So this is the price we are willing to take, and that's why people are fighting very hard on our future.
Wow. So Arnold, so one country, two systems cannot work, or can you work within that principle?
Well, I think the principle is just theoretically, the principle is no longer working because China is not actually allowing Hong Kong to have its own autonomy, which were once promised in our mini constitution, that on a joint declaration we are promised that we have autonomy and we have democracy and we have freedom. But is China not going on that line, that they cross the line and they affect our own autonomy? So it's Beijing that they force the one country, two system principle to be not working. And I think to really make the system have a chance to be working, that China will need to withdraw their hardline policy on Hong Kong and really allow Hong Kong to develop its own democracy and political system.
And you don't see Tiananmen like massacre, or something like Tiananmen happening in Hong Kong. It's no longer feasible at this point, right?
Well, originally, I would say that is not very possible, but as you have seen, that what happens in the Chinese university, what happens in the PolyU, that there are actually many direct confrontations between protesters and police force nowadays, and things escalated very quickly. So there is chance that that anything could happen. We are not putting any possibilities away, because that we are not. It is difficult to really have an expectation on Hong Kong police nowadays, and even the military forces stationed in Hong Kong. So it might happen very sadly.
So how do you? I know that there is no grand planning or grand strategy, but how do you see this being? You need a political solution, you said. But in your,
Yes.
from the ground, how do you see this coming to an end?
Well, I think the point is that the recent victory of the Democrats in the district council election really opened a window for the government to propose political change, because well, once again, we used the number of votes, we used the numbers of huge amount of Hong Kong people really voiced out in the recent election that we really need the 5 demands to be answered by the government. So it is now a political window for our people to really work on that. But if the government ignores such a window, then the protest will be going on, and then people will not fall back, especially after such a landslide victory of on the side of the people of Hong Kong. That it is expected for the movement to keep going for at least 2 to 3 months, and then we will see if there are any political chance for the government to really work on the 5 demands.
On that note, there's a bit of hope there with that little window you talked about. Thank you very much, Arnold, for taking time out from your very busy schedule to talk to us. And to our listeners and viewers, we will continue to watch Hong Kong. It's just how many hours flight away from Manila. And this big democracy movement, and some are already calling it sort of a revolution. So let's keep watching what's going on in Hong Kong. And thank you, Arnold. We will stay in touch. And stay safe.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.